Hey, I have a story for you as we begin this session. This is a story from The Peacemaker, page 201. This is a book by Ken Sand. I just can't forgive Pam's adultery, Rick said. She says she's sorry and she's begged for forgiveness, but I can't forget what she did. It's like a huge wall between us, and I can't get through it. So you think divorce is the answer? I asked. I don't know what else to do. I told her that I forgive her, but I just can't be close to her again. She's depressed and has withdrawn even further from me. I'm afraid she's going to look for intimacy someplace else, or with someone else. We're both in agony, and it seems like we'd be better off divorced. I could see the weariness in his face. Rick, I'm sure that both of you are in terrible pain, but I don't think divorce is going to end it. You'll just trade one kind of pain for another. There is a way to keep your marriage together and truly put the past behind you, but you won't find it with the empty forgiveness that you've offered Pam. What do you mean, empty forgiveness? Rick, imagine that you had just confessed a serious sin to God, and for the first time in your life, He spoke to you out loud. I forgive you, Rick, but I can't ever be close to you again. How would you feel? After an awkward pause, he replied, I guess I'd feel that God really hadn't forgiven me. But isn't that exactly the way you are forgiving Pam? I asked. Rick looked at the floor, wrestling for an answer. In a softer voice, I said, Imagine instead that God said, Rick, I forgive you. I promise never to think about your sin again, or to dwell on it, or brood over it. I promise never to bring it up and use it against you. I promise not to talk to others about it. And I promise not to let this sin stand between us or hinder our relationship. After a long silence, tears began to fill Rick's eyes. I would know I was completely forgiven. After a long silence, tears began to fill Rick's eyes. I would know I was completely forgiven. But I wouldn't deserve that kind of forgiveness after the way I've treated Pam. Would you ever deserve it? I asked. God's forgiveness is a free gift purchased for you by Jesus' death on the cross. He doesn't forgive you because you've earned it. He forgives you because He loves you. When you truly understand how precious and undeserved His forgiveness is, you'll want to forgive Pam in the same way that He's forgiven you. I know I should, but how can I ever keep those promises? I can't imagine forgetting what Pam did, and I just don't feel like I could ever be close to her again. Hold on, Rick. Where in the Bible does it say that forgiveness is forgetting? Or that forgiveness depends on feelings? Forgiveness is a choice, a decision you make by God's grace in spite of your feelings. Of course it's hard, especially in a case like this. But if you ask for God's help as you make those promises to Pam, He will give you the grace to follow through on them. We talked for another 30 minutes about God's forgiveness. As Rick reflected on how much God had forgiven him, he discovered a longing to do the same with Pam. We prayed together, and then I called Pam and asked her to join us at my office. When she came in, doubt and fear were written all over her face. As soon as she sat down, Rick began, Pam, I need to ask for your forgiveness. I have sinned so terribly against you. You asked me to forgive you, and I wouldn't give you real forgiveness. Instead, I've punished you with my bitterness and coldness. I have been so wrong. Will you please forgive me? Well, this couple spent many hours of pastoral counseling after that to address some of the root causes of the trouble in their marriage. But by God's grace, they could at least now deal with those problems together. A great story as we begin this session talking about forgiving from the heart. You know, forgiveness is probably the key to peacemaking. Colossians 3:13 says, bearing with one another and forgiving one another if someone happens to have a complaint against anyone else. Just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also forgive others. Peacemakers forgive freely. Peacemakers forgive freely. As forgiveness happens, true forgiveness, what is really happening are we're making some promises to each other with genuine forgiveness. We're going to talk about those 4 promises. I'm labeling them as no worries, no weapons, no walls, and no whispering. We'll talk about that in just a couple minutes. My wife Laura was deeply offended by a good friend, a dear friend of hers. Back in the year 2000, we were working in West Africa, and this deep hurt was caused by a betrayal. And Laura carried that with her over the next almost 4 years. But in the process of that time of healing, she realized that whether or not she ever saw that person again, she needed to forgive that person for what they had done and be able to let go and be free of that. Well, in the spring of 2004, we were living in Montana, and Laura decided she was going to write out the whole episode, all the hurt, all the pain, just write it all out, and it was pages and pages of what she wrote. Then she took it out of our back door onto a deck area, and she put it in a large stainless steel bowl, and she lit the pages on fire. As the ashes drifted up and away from that steel bowl that day, it was a powerful picture, powerful image of what had gone on in Laura's heart by forgiving this opponent, this friend, who had hurt so deeply. But Laura, from that point on, was free of that and wasn't carrying that baggage around with her. You know, in 2010, we ended up working with this friend, these friends of ours, working with them again, and further healing took place at that point as well. So what is forgiveness? Ken Sand says this in his book: forgiveness is neither a feeling, nor forgetting, nor excusing. To forgive someone means to release him or her from liability to suffer punishment or penalty at your hands. Why do we do this? Why do we forgive? And why is it so important? I would say it this way: we forgive to live. That's just a great way for me to remember it. We forgive to live. Peacemakers forgive freely. Let's talk about our first promise. No worries. And when I say no worries, I'm saying I will not dwell on this incident. I'm not going to obsess over this. In Jeremiah 31, verse 34, we read this: I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. This is what God says to his people. I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. There's a couple different Greek words in the New Testament that are used for forgiveness, and one of those is aphiemi. It's often translated as forgive, and it means to let go or release or remit. It often refers to debts that have been paid or canceled in full, such as in Matthew 5:26. But we have a hard time forgetting, don't we? God can forget and forgive, but we, in our little pea brains, we have a hard time forgetting. The way to truly let go in our mind is one way to think about it is to flip the situation upside down, kind of like Jesus talked about in Luke 6, in part of the Beatitudes section, where he says, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. And so Jesus, in some of his teaching here, he says, flip the situation upside down from what is absolutely expected, right? Ken Sand talks about this idea as the replacement principle. We must replace negative thoughts and memories with positive ones. Every time you begin to obsess over what someone has done, ask for God's help and deliberately pray for that person. Or think of something about the offender that is true, that is noble, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, or praiseworthy, from Philippians 4:8. Peacemakers forgive freely, no worries, and no weapons. And this promise basically is, I will not bring this up again. I will not bring this up again and use it as a weapon against you. Psalm 103:12 says, as far as the east is from the west, so far as he removed our transgressions from us. Another word that's used and translated forgiveness is charizomai, and it means to bestow favor freely or unconditionally. This is the word that's used in Colossians 3:16 that we read earlier, and it shows that forgiveness is undeserved and cannot be earned. Another story from The Peacemaker, but it's actually a story about Thomas Edison. When Thomas Edison and his staff were developing the incandescent light bulb, it took hundreds of hours to manufacture a single bulb. One day, after finishing a bulb, he handed it to a young errand boy and asked him to take it upstairs to the testing room. As the boy turned and started up the stairs, he tripped and fell, and the bulb shattered on the steps. Instead of rebuking the boy, Edison reassured him and then turned to his staff and told them to start working on another bulb. When it was completed several days later, Edison demonstrated the reality of his forgiveness in the most powerful way possible. He walked over to the same boy, handed him the bulb, and said, "Please take this up to the testing room." Imagine how that boy must have felt. He knew that he didn't deserve to be trusted with this responsibility again, yet here it was, being offered to him as though nothing had ever happened. Nothing could have restored this boy to the team more clearly, more quickly, and more fully. An example of how peacemakers forgive freely. No worries, no weapons, and no walls. I will not let this incident, this situation stand between us or hinder our relationship. Going along so closely with 1 Corinthians 13:5, love keeps no record of wrongs. Some of you may recognize the name Corrie ten Boom. She was with her family put in prison in World War II and put she and her sister together in a concentration camp and badly treated. Her sister ended up dying in a concentration camp, but she survived. And then after the war was over, she had opportunities to go around speaking in churches and telling of her experience and God's provision for her. She tells this story. It was at a church service in Munich that I saw him, the former SS man who had stood guard at the shower room door in the processing center at Ravensbrück. He was the first of our actual jailers that I had seen since that time, and suddenly it was all there. The room full of mocking men, the heaps of clothing, Betsy's pain-blanched face. He came up to me as the church was emptying, beaming and bowing. "How grateful I am for your message, Fräulein," he said. "To think that, as you say, he has washed my sins away." His hand was thrust out to shake mine, and I, who had preached so often to the people in Bloemendaal about the need to forgive, kept my hand at my side. Even as the angry, vengeful thoughts boiled through me, I saw the sin of them. Jesus Christ had died for this man. Was I going to ask for more than that? Lord Jesus, I prayed, forgive me and help me to forgive him. I tried to smile. I struggled to raise my hand, but I could not. I felt nothing, not the slightest spark of warmth or charity. And so again, I breathed a silent prayer. Jesus, I cannot forgive him. Give me your forgiveness. As I took his hand, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder, along my arm, through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for this stranger that almost overwhelmed me. So I discovered that it is not on our forgiveness any more than on our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on him. When he tells us to love our enemies, he gives, along with the command, the love itself. No weapons, no walls, no worries. Peacemakers forgive freely. And then number 4, no whispering. What do I mean by that? We're making a promise. I will not talk to anyone else about this incident. Proverbs 26:20 presents a familiar picture to probably most all of us. Where there is no wood, a fire goes out, and where there is no gossip, contention ceases. Do you remember being at a bonfire or campfire? What happens when you put extra wood on the fire? Does the fire go out? No. The fire grows, it builds, and becomes hotter and hotter. But perhaps when it's time to go, we don't keep adding wood to the fire. We want the fire to go out, and so we don't add wood to the fire. We take the pieces of wood, we kind of separate them a little bit, separate the coals, and then if we're good campers, we pour water and make sure the fire is completely out. Where there is no gossip, contention ceases. The fight stops. Along with this promise of no whispering, I want to give a couple of cautions. I would urge you to be careful in your venting. Do you know the word venting? Sometimes people with a close, trusted friend, they will share what they're feeling and kind of what we would maybe say in English, blow off steam. I would urge care when you're venting, that not be a time of adding logs to the fire. Another time when we tend to do this, brother and sister, is when we're at a prayer meeting. And sometimes it's very quick to begin talking about something as a prayer request, but what we're actually doing is we're giving our version of a story. I would urge caution about this because the Bible does. When we forgive, truly forgive, we are making these 4 promises. No whispering, no weapons, no walls, and no worries. Where does forgiveness happen? It happens in our thoughts, in our words, in our actions. Let's talk about those for the next couple of minutes. We're in a constant battle for our minds. When I have been offended, there are several things that I need to believe in order to come to the place of forgiveness. Number 1, I need to believe that the offense is forgivable. And it is. I need to remember that Christ died for this sin too. I need to remind myself of all that I have been forgiven. And then I choose to let it go. We're not so good at forgetting, though, right? This is why the replacement principle is so powerful. Let's use an example. Let's say that you share a house with someone and he or she has a much different view of personal stuff and personal space than you do. They tend to borrow things without asking, even borrow your car without asking. One time. But you've tried to overlook this issue, but it is becoming a wall between the two of you. As a peacemaker, you want to forgive freely, and you can with God's help. How do you keep the promises of forgiveness in your thoughts? Well, instead of dwelling on how much he or she is taking from you, begin to think about how much God has blessed you. Instead of planning how you're going to, quote, give them a taste of their own medicine, instead plan out how you're going to bless them in an unexpected way. Instead of shutting them out, closing them off from your thoughts and emotions, think about how to build a new bridge to them. Plan out how you're going to bless them in the ears of someone else. A declaration is a powerful thing. Let's talk about words for a moment. How do you keep the promise of forgiveness in your words? Well, we'll keep this same example, and this example works for brothers and sisters as well. Not obsessing about the issue is mainly a battle of the mind, but we can also choose words that communicate that we are thinking about many other things. And it always benefits others when we speak the goodness and generosity of God. Spoken words can be powerful weapons, especially when you put a razor's edge on your tone. Instead of using words to cut or bash over the head, choose words to say that will communicate warmth and healing. If you talk about your opponent with anyone else, be sure that you speak well of them and refuse to bring up this issue. If it is dealt with, then it is done. If you talk about it with others, then it becomes primarily your issue. So speak well about him or her to others, and speak well about them to them. C.S. Lewis said, "Don't waste time bothering whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you did." As soon as we do this, we find one of the great secrets. When you are behaving as if you loved someone, you will presently come to love him. What do you think about that? Is he just talking about faking it until you make it? Ken Sand, in his book, tells just a brief story about how this worked for him when he and his wife were having an argument, a fight about something, and he was having a hard time forgiving. Well, he decided to do some act of kindness for his wife, just out of obedience. And the moment he did that, he began to have warm feelings for her again. And that's what brought them back together. So I think, what C.S. Lewis is saying is that when you behave as if you love someone, you will eventually come to feel it and realize, I really do love them. And I'm showing it, and I'm also feeling it, right? In our example, buy or make something for your friend or your brother or sister to show that the issue that was between you is not plaguing your mind anymore. Plan a favorite activity for the two of you to do together that will communicate, hey, no weapons, no walls, just hugs and bridges. Or you could invite a group of friends together for a meaningful time to say, hey, we are all okay with each other. Friends, peacemakers forgive freely. No worries, no weapons, no walls, no whispers, no problem. I hope that you are desiring to become that sort of a peacemaker. May God help us each as we grow in our abilities to make peace with each other for the church and for God's glory.